How do you make a skyscraper both internationally relevant and locally appropriate at the same time?
Local appropriateness, of course, has to do with a host of factors that will vary from place to place to place. But I think first of all, the commercial factors, which do vary, the way that the market absorbs, uses, and exerts pressures on a building tend to have a great deal of influence on the building itself, and that means how do corporations, banks, those who use offices need and want their space configured. Of course, depths, not just depths, but the way people come into buildings, the security, the feeling of belonging to one corporation or to a general mass of people coming into a building with shared tenancies. So the New York building, for example, doesn't need a drop-off. Everything is off the street because it's that sort of fluid urban condition, whereas in Shanghai would tend to have drop-offs. London might be a bit different. So these issues, of course, of local appropriateness, particularly at the ground floor, which is the trickiest part of a high-rise building anyway, since so many people, 5, 10, or even 20,000 people are coming out of the ground at the same time. So how they will mix and how they will behave is quite different from culture to culture, excuse me, even city to city. So the local appropriateness, the advancing and international cause of things, that to me has more to do with the engineering of a building, that the solutions which are a bit more universal or that are there to combat the challenges that are more universal of wind or earthquake, horizontal forces, the structural means by which a tall building is configured does make advances that are transferred then from place to place to place. I think the 8-column, mega-column building, which we see in ICC, IFC, the whole series of buildings now, which at the super tall level will likely consider that solution, is something that was propounded maybe 15 years ago, put into practice, now is being refined. And so we feel we're part of, since a few of our buildings fit that configuration, including the Lotte Tower, we feel we're sort of part of an international ongoing research project, mostly through our engineers, in this case, the structural engineers.
So you said it was an ongoing research project you feel like you're in. What's the research objective in that project?
Well, the idea is it's not truly a research project. I mean, these are shared efforts with results that are seen together, though, over time. So there are goals of efficiency and obviously in finding better ways to use materials more sparingly, or security. I remember when post 9/11, the whole issue of whether a megacolumn could be vulnerable to an attack, and somebody in a project in Hong Kong flew an airplane engine out of megacolumn mock-up, and the column wasn't damaged, but the engine was mashed to look like a raisin. So in a sense, that's somebody's research for one project, but it is adopted or used to advantage in the next project by a different owner, maybe with a different engineer, but there's a kind of a shared knowledge, and presumably that's one of the things that the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitats is promoting, information exchange.
So tell us about One Vanderbilt and its presence as an as-of-right project. First of all, describe what that is versus a rights assembly project, and what lessons that might have for cities outside of New York.
Yeah. Well, as of right in New York is a pretty, compared to approvals in some other cities, becomes quite predictable and a bit cut and dry in a good way for the developer and for the architect. So if one sticks to a basic geometry of the site that has to do with certain sky plane envelopes, sky exposure plane envelopes, that are a bit tricky to figure out mathematically, but they can be figured out. And of course, if one sticks by the use and by the FAR, or GFA, then the process is more or less guaranteed. The building can take on any appearance, configuration, as long as it fits within those parameters. But as New York becomes more and more dense and sites are exploited to the maximum, to a greater proportion of sites, then we find that more and more of the sites that are available for a development that are attractive to a developer or a builder or an investor will more and more likely now require some kind of exception to the rule. Otherwise, why would you improve upon a building that already maxes out in some way its capability? So the dynamic then, first of all, is that the city may look at areas where it wants to stimulate growth and may change either that as of rights designation, or it may even suggest that special permits could be available under certain conditions. It almost invites the developer to apply for an exception to that rule. So the One Vanderbilt project, which initially, for which initially the site would yield, I believe, a 15 FAR solution, and then with certain air rights transfers up to 18 and then up to 21.6, has been granted a 30 FAR because of a city policy that focused on that particular area of town. It's almost like a concentrated zoning area, preferential zoning area. And this had to do with ideas about East Midtown being aged and losing its relevance as a kind of a Class A internationally competitive office district, that you'd need some way to offer a greater density in order to make it reasonable to invest in a new building. And sometimes, or in all cases, since there are no empty sites, tear down an older, really obsolete building, if you will, with obsolete mechanical systems, less than minimum floor-to-floors, and so on. So this is the sort of situation with Vanderbilt, that the building really went ahead only as a function of a kind of a wave of city support for a policy that would allow for an increased density. Then the building had to go, and the owner and the architect on their own, to city planning to say, now with this encouragement, now we would like to apply for this exceptional density of 30 times the plot ratio, and go through the fairly rigorous universal land use review process, the ULURP process, with all of its environmental impact statements, but also the arguments about the way that the building would relate to landmark structures nearby, in this case Grand Central Terminal, the way pedestrians would be treated at the ground plane, et cetera, et cetera. And in the process of applying for this special permit, then it allows the city and allows others who might be participating in this dialogue, and some of them are extra-governmental. They are groups such as the Landmarks Conservancy groups, a private group, but it allows them to get into the act of negotiating, if you will. And so in the case of One Vanderbilt, the deal was struck, which is not a deal that is previewed on the books. It's not a guideline that's followed in order to get the bonus, but rather a kind of a handshake deal of a negotiation that would happen perhaps on no other site, which is that the developer, SL Green, will give or spend $220 million to improve the subway platforms, stairways, sidewalk conditions, and create a plaza in front of their building. So these are off-site improvements made in the form of a bargain from a private developer to the city in order to gain more potential area to develop on their said site. It's a very interesting kind of public-private deal, which is not really clear until years, in fact, a couple of years of battles have been fought or negotiations have been had, but in the end, it's quite a happy solution.
So tell us how One Vanderbilt embraces its status as or position building on air rights over a railroad, and why other buildings in that position maybe didn't take as much advantage of it as One Vanderbilt has.
Well, One Vanderbilt is kind of the ideal standard bearer for a denser East Midtown. It's the best site. by nature. It's not that it's arbitrarily chosen, but it happens to be both on a wide street, 42nd Street, wider than 43rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and on an avenue, Madison Avenue. And in fact, Vanderbilt is also sort of an avenue. So naturally, the wider the street, the easier to accommodate a taller building, because density and porosity or openness are complements, of course, of each other. The next sort of special attribute of this site is that it finds itself directly adjacent to Grand Central Terminal. So if you are to move from the concourse with the information kiosk and the clock underneath the fresco of the heavens in the main hall of Grand Central Terminal, there is no site closer other than the Grand Hyatt site. We're actually doing this interview today, than the Vanderbilt site. So connections that are not just obvious, but they're meaningful and useful to bring people out of a very, very densely packed and intensely flowing series of commuters is optimally handled by this site. Another thing that makes the site optimal for high-density building is that being next to Grand Central Terminal, the terminal itself is about 100 feet high. Depending on how you look at the section, it's 2 or 7 stories tall, depending on where you're looking at internal intricacies of that building. But it essentially caps itself off at a very low level. So if you look at the urban amalgam of buildings around the area, you have above Grand Central Terminal a kind of a space park, open air that will never be built upon. Of course, the MetLife now, what's it now called? I guess it is MetLife, before it was Pan Am building, was a kind of unusual leap of a building on top of a building. But one can assume there will be no building in the future above Grand Central Terminal. So Vanderbilt then, as a tall building, will enjoy open light and air views and exposure in perpetuity to the east and to the southeast. So it makes sense. One would fill with the tallest building that kind of a site. Otherwise, there is the making of Vanderbilt Plaza, which is now a bit of Vanderbilt Avenue, more or less a disused piece of roadway in the city with parked police cars and sort of leftover security functions. So what this building allows for, both financially and spatially, is the decommissioning of that road and the reestablishment of that space as a public plaza. And only really with the funds that are thrown off by a very large building and the sort of activities at the front door that include leading people into the building, does establishing this Vanderbilt Plaza make sense. But it's another critical part of what makes the building very appropriate for the place.